Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 11 about public policy. It's Lesson 6 concerning monetary policy. In this lesson, you'll learn about monetary policy, you'll learn about the Federal Reserve, you'll learn about reserve requirements, about the federal funds rate, and about bond purchasing. In the previous lesson, we learned about the business cycle, about how the economy has ups and downs, and during those down times, we can have recessions. Voters who experience these down times demand that the government does something about it. Frequently, the economy is the top concern of people as they go to vote, and politicians need to respond to this. But there's a problem. Our economy is one of free market choices, where individuals really decide what the economy is doing, whether it's behaving strongly or weakly. So there's really only limited power that the government can have to take care of the economy. So government actions about the economy will only have a marginal impact. They aren't going to be able to prevent recessions from happening. They're going to be able to prevent inflation from happening, for example. What they can do, though, perhaps, is make the highs a little less high and the lows a little less low, so that while we may occasionally have recessions, they won't be as deep as they otherwise would be. They won't turn into depressions, for example. And when we're having high times and the economy's growing, it won't grow too fast and have inflation out of control. So maybe they can smooth out the rough edges, but we'll continue to have the business cycle of ups and downs. Well, how does the government try to manage the economy in this way? How do they try to smooth out the rough edges? There are two basic mechanisms that the government uses to manage the economy. One of those is called monetary policy. The other is called fiscal policy. In this lesson, we're going to consider monetary policy. In the next lesson, we'll talk about fiscal policy. Monetary policy is about how much money is in the economy. Now, why does that matter? Well, if people have more money, at least theoretically speaking, they'll spend more money. And as they spend more money, there'll be more demand for the goods and services that they are buying, and that'll stimulate economic growth. And having a growing economy then means we'll have less unemployment, for example. So, by getting more money out there, maybe we can help the economy. But there's a downside to doing that. And the downside can be seen as we consider this other economic concept, scarcity value. Now, you're going to have to remember this concept for an exam, but it's a good one to learn here just to understand why manipulating the money supply can have such a big effect on the economy. Here we have a picture of diamonds. Diamonds are very valuable because they're so rare. And that idea that when something is scarce, it becomes more valuable applies to money also. When money is more scarce, it also is more valuable. While if you have more money in the economy, then the money becomes less valuable. So if we have more dollars, each of those dollars is less valuable, which is essentially the same as inflation. Think about it. If before we get more money in the economy, it costs $2 to buy a gallon of milk. But then because we have more dollars and they become less valuable, it then requires $3 to buy a gallon of milk. That's essentially the same as the price of milk being raised. It is inflation, but it's caused by there being more dollars out there. The flip side of this is if people have less money, then they have less to spend, which then decreases the demand for goods and services, which will then cause the companies that produce these to produce less and hire fewer people, etc. It slows the economy down. And it's a way to fight inflation then. If inflation is out of control, prices are going through the roof, then if you can reduce the amount of money that is out there, then it will become more valuable, and then inflation will slow. So fewer dollars makes each dollar more valuable. So hopefully you begin to understand now how regulating how much money is floating around out there in the economy can have an effect on the health of the economy. It can try to smooth out some of those rough edges of things getting too high and us having too much inflation, or too low and us having a bad economy with a bunch of unemployment, etc. Well, who is in charge of deciding how many dollars are out there? And how do they go about doing this? That job falls to the Federal Reserve. It's an agency of the United States government that is also called the Fed. That's its nickname. If you hear the Fed talked about on TV, they're talking about the Federal Reserve, and they are in charge of the money supply. So the Fed engages in monetary policy, in other words, regulating the money supply, in three ways. And we're going to talk about each of these. The first of those is something called the reserve requirement. To understand the reserve requirement, you have to first recognize that banks don't just hold your money when you deposit them in a bank. They don't just go back and put it in a vault and keep it there waiting for you to come back and get it. Instead, they loan it to other people. But that presents a potential problem. What if you come back for your money and they don't have it? What if a bunch of people come back for their money and they don't have it? So, in anticipation of that problem, banks keep some of the money on reserve. Not all of it. They loan a bunch of it out. But they keep some of it around to give to people if they happen to show up wanting their money. Well, the amount of money that they have to keep on reserve in case people show up and want their money is called the reserve requirement. It's how much cash they have to have on hand to give out to people if they come asking. Well, how much is that? That amount is actually set by the Fed. They tell the banks how much they have to have in reserve, and the Fed adjusts this amount depending on what they want to do with the economy, how they want to adjust the money supply to smooth out these rough edges that we're talking about. Here's how they do it. If the Fed lowers the reserve requirement, in other words, tells banks that, hey, you don't need to keep as much money around back in the vault, then banks are free to loan more money out to people. And when they loan that more money out to people, then there's more money out in the economy. They've increased the supply of money. And their hope is that now that those people have the money out in the economy that they've got loans for, they will use that money to build houses and buy cars and go shopping at Walmart or whatever it is. And in doing that, they will then put other people to work. So by lowering the reserve requirement, they are encouraging banks to give out loans, which they hope will stimulate the economy. Now, what if they do the opposite? What if they raise the reserve requirement instead? In other words, tell banks that you have to keep more on hand. Then the banks are going to loan less money out. People are then going to have less money in their hands to go buy houses, go buy cars, etc., which means they're not going to buy those things, and people are not going to be put to work making those things, and it's going to slow the economy down. So if they're worried about inflation, they're going to raise the reserve requirement. If they're worried about unemployment, they're going to lower the reserve requirement. That's how the Fed's going to try to manipulate the economy. If they're worried about the economy is doing badly, they lower the reserve requirement to stimulate it. If they think the economy is going too fast, then they raise the reserve requirement to slow it down. Again, they're trying to smooth out those highs and lows in the economy. They can't stop them from happening, but maybe they can make them a little less extreme. The second way that the Fed engages in monetary policy is through what's called the federal funds rate. The federal funds rate sets the interest rates that banks charge each other in order to meet their reserve requirements. Now, the reason that banks have to borrow money from each other and they charge interest to each other is that the banks, as they go through the day loaning out money, at the end of the day, they may realize, oh, wait a minute, we don't have enough money on hand to match the reserve requirement that we are obligated to maintain. And so they've got to get some money from somewhere so they don't get in trouble for violating the reserve requirement. Well, where they get that money from is they borrow it from another bank. There's some other bank that has a little extra money sitting around, and so they borrow it from them. But the banks aren't just nice to each other, handing each other money to overnight to make sure that everybody stays within their reserve requirement. Instead, they charge each other for that privilege. They charge each other interest as they loan money to each other. But what interest rate do they charge? That is determined by the Fed. The Fed sets something called the federal funds rate. Essentially what they're doing is they're telling people, this is what you can borrow money from us for, the interest rate we will charge you. And if they're willing to charge that interest rate, then you're not going to borrow from some bank if they're going to charge more than that. So essentially it forces all the banks to charge the same amount, no more. All right, so by setting the federal funds rate, then the Fed is determining how difficult it is going to be for banks to borrow money from each other. So let's think about how this is going to affect the money supply. If the federal funds rate is low, then banks aren't going to be scared of getting stuck at the end of the day with too little money in their vault, because they can just simply borrow it from another bank overnight. Because the rate's really low, that won't cost them a lot, and they'll make more by loaning the money out to people. So they'll be a lot more loose, a lot more free with their money, give out more loans, and that'll increase the money supply, which then is hoped will stimulate the economy. So if the Fed wants to stimulate the economy, then what they do is they lower the federal funds rate. Conversely, if they want to slow down the economy because they're scared of inflation or something, then what they do is they raise the federal funds rate. They've now made it more expensive for banks to borrow from each other, which means that the banks wanting to turn a profit are going to be reluctant to borrow from each other, which then means that they will be a lot more careful loaning out their money. They won't loan out as much, and then there won't be as much money out there being spent. So there won't be as much demand for things, and then there won't be as many things produced, and there won't be as many people hired, etc. So by raising the federal funds rate, they can slow the economy down. The third monetary policy that the Fed uses to manage the economy concerns the buying and selling of bonds. Well, what is a bond? A bond is an I.O.U. issued by some institution, perhaps a government like a city, or it could be the national government. They issue treasury bonds. This is the way that governments and other institutions raise money to go do something. They sell these I.O.U.s to people. So they may sell you a bond for $1,000, and you can come back in 30 years and you can turn in your bond to get, say, I'll just use a big round number, $1,500 back. So by buying this piece of paper and holding on to it for 30 years, you make a 50% profit, or whatever it would be. Now, those aren't the exact numbers that actually happen, but you get the idea of how this works. So these government entities or other institutions sell bonds in order to raise money for themselves. What the Fed then does is it either buys these bonds, or once it's bought some of them, it turns around and sells them. And it does this to manipulate the economy. Now let's think about how this would work. Imagine that you've bought one of these bonds. You now have a piece of paper to hold on to for the next 30 years. That means you don't have that $1,000 that you otherwise would have had. Well, you can't walk into Walmart with a bond and buy a new flat screen TV. That bond is just going to sit in your safety deposit box for the next 30 years. So you're not going to be buying anything with it. You're not going to be stimulating the economy with it. On the other hand, if you had that $1,000 instead, maybe you would go buy that flat screen TV from Walmart. So by manipulating whether or not you have that bond in your hand, the Fed can manipulate what money is available out there in the economy. That's what they try to do. So what happens is, if the Fed starts selling bonds to people, and the way they would do that is they would say, okay, we've got a bond here that if you cash it in 30 years, you'll get $1,500 for it. Well, we'll sell it to you right now for $1,100. So you say, wow, I can make a profit of $400 off that, so I'll buy the bond from them. So they offer these sales. They've got a bunch of bonds that they've bought previously. Now they're going to turn around and sell them. Well, as they sell them, they're bringing money into the Fed. So their bank account is, so to speak, they're a big bank, is swelling. But at the same time, what they're doing is, as they bring that money into the Fed, they are taking it out of the economy. Every time they sell a bond to somebody, now they have that person's money and that person doesn't, which means that person is not using that money to buy something. So they're reducing the amount of money out there. They're slowing the economy down when they sell bonds. On the other hand, if they buy bonds, then what they're doing is they're reducing their money. They are expending funds in order to buy these pieces of paper that now they're going to sit on for 30 years. Well, as they buy these, they're putting money into the economy then, which they then hope people are going to go out and spend to stimulate the economy. Now, there's a problem with this, though, potentially, when they buy all these bonds. And that is, where do they get the money from to buy them? The truth is they conjure the money out of thin air. They truly do. The way it works is somebody sells them a bond, and they say, okay, where do you have a bank account? Oh, you have it at Citibank? All right, we'll let Citibank know that you have got that we're going to pay them $1,000, and then they'll give you the $1,000. That's the way they do it. And then how do they give Citibank the $1,000? They say, well, you know, Citibank, you've got an account with us, the Federal Reserve. We just added $1,000 to your account. They didn't actually get $1,000 bills and put them into the Citi's account. Instead, what they did was they just punched a button on a keyboard and said there's $1,000 in there now that wasn't. They invented the money out of thin air. Now, you can see a potential problem with this, and that is, as they're inventing money out of thin air, they're increasing the amount of money out there, which makes each dollar less valuable, which means they're essentially creating inflation. Now, at any time that you might be listening to this lesson, the circumstances that we could be in could be changed. So what I'm going to say right now is specific to the moment that I'm recording this lesson. It may not be true at some later time listening to it. But since the time of what was called the Great Recession in 2008, the Fed has been doing all it could to stimulate the economy. It has been keeping the reserve requirement low, it's been keeping the federal funds rate low, and it has been buying bonds. Yet despite stimulating the economy has just been barely growing, which then has people worried. What happens if we have a recession tomorrow? And the Fed wants to do something to help with that recession. They really have no tools left to use. They've already kept the reserve requirement about as low as they can keep it. They've already kept the federal funds rate about as low as they can keep it. They've already bought about as many bonds as they can buy. They sort of have nothing left to do to stimulate the economy if it comes down to them needing to do so. All right, let's review now what we learned in this lesson. What does monetary policy concern? Does it concern taxing and spending, the money supply, foreign relations, social progress? Monetary policy is about the money supply. What does the Federal Reserve do? Does it protect wildlife? Does it manage the money supply? Does it conserve great works of art, or does it store seeds? The Federal Reserve manages the money supply. What is the reserve requirement? Is it a down payment that banks require? Is it how banks pay their owners? Is it who banks must loan to? Or is it what banks must keep on hand? The reserve requirement is the money that banks have to keep on hand in case somebody who's deposited their money with the bank wants to come get their money. What is the federal funds rate? Is it what banks charge customers? What banks charge each other? What banks charge the Fed? Or how many banks fail? The federal funds rate is what banks charge each other when they loan each other money. What is a bond? Is it two banks that are merging? Is it a license to open a bank? Is it an I.O.U? Or is it a law about banks? A bond is an I.O.U issued by some institution to raise money for themselves that the Federal Reserve then engages in the buying and selling of. What increases the money supply? Or I should say, not what. Why increase the money supply? Excuse me. Do you do it to stimulate the economy? Do you do it to slow the economy? Do you do it to pay the debt? Or do you do it to pay the deficit? You will increase the money supply to stimulate the economy. All right, that completes this lesson. The next lesson will also be from Unit 11. It'll be Lesson 7 about fiscal policy.